summer in our sequence of Democracy Summer Seminars on Fridays. Today, alas, is our very last installment, and we are using it to talk about structural democracy dysfunction and deficits in the country, and what is the democracy agenda itself in America. So I'm going to talk for maybe around 20 minutes, trying to give an overview of these different topics, and then we'll engage in Q&A discussion. I want to thank all the Democracy Summer Fellows for their wonderful participation in last night's graduation festivities, which were really wonderful to watch and to see everything that you've been doing this summer. And I'm really glad that you got to interact a little bit with Professor Danielle Allen and with Dar Williams. And thank you for bringing your families and your friends and teachers and stuff along. This is a really important subject for us because I want everybody to focus on the fact that Donald Trump is not just the architect and organizer of our democratic dysfunction in America today, on everything from the census to the post office to the election, but he's also a product of that dysfunction. He's a symptom of the deeper maladies we're facing, as well as being someone who's reinforcing and exacerbating our condition. So let's, though, start on a somewhat more hopeful note by invoking not our worst Republican president of all time, but our last great Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, who spoke of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that beautiful, tantalizing Lincolnian ideal is, of course, dramatically different from the way the country started. We began not as a universal enfranchised democracy, but rather as a slave republic of Christian white male property owners over the age of 21. And that is by design, and that's why the right to vote in Article 1 of the Constitution was left to the states. It was up to the state legislatures, the local power brokers, the slave masters, the state-based elites to decide who would get to vote and who not. It's only been through a process of vast popular social struggle and political conflict that we've been able to open the democracy up and bring people in. Our Constitution did not begin with anything like the provisions that exist in the vast majority of constitutions, democratic constitutions around the world today. If you look at, for example, the new South Africa Constitution, it starts off by saying that every citizen of South Africa has a right to vote at every level of government, to be represented, to have their votes counted. We didn't have anything like that in the US Constitution, and even today, we don't have anything close to that, which is why we still have millions and millions of disenfranchised people. What we've got in America is a series of kind of ragtag, ad hoc, anti-discrimination voting amendments that were added through very specific social, political, military struggles. After the Civil War, we added the so-called Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery, the 14th Amendment, which established equal protection and due process rights of the people against their state governments, and then the 15th Amendment, which banned discrimination in voting based upon race. Okay, so that takes us back to 1868. So those were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 17th Amendment shifted the mode of election of US senators from the state legislatures, which was another indirect anti-popular mechanism that was set up in the original Constitution, to selection by the people. That's what gave us direct election of US senators in 1913. The 19th Amendment in 1920, exactly a century ago, gave us women's suffrage. So it was a century ago that women were dealt into the Constitution and the political democracy. The 23rd Amendment gave people in the seat of government in Washington, D.C., the right to participate in presidential elections, although not in congressional elections, which is why Washingtonians are still not represented either in the House or the Senate, and are the only citizens of a national capital on earth who are disenfranchised in their own parliament or legislature. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes in federal elections, which was one of the mechanisms used to exclude African Americans and poor whites from voting for a long time, even after passage of the 15th Amendment. And the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18, saying that the right to vote shall not be denied on account of age for everybody who's 18 years or older. Now, you'll notice a few things there. That you get that kind of steady expansion of the electorate, the deepening and the expansion of the meaning of suffrage rights in the country. But you also see that a majority of the constitutional amendments that we've had since the original 10 in the Bill of Rights were about voting. So this has been a central terrain of political contest and social struggle in our history. So in the same way that everybody in America today is freaked out about the president's assault on the post office, an attempt to interfere with mail-in voting, and his clear efforts to suppress the vote and repress the vote and depress the vote. That has been a constant theme in our history. As bizarre and deranged as his actions are, this struggle is a struggle that goes back to the very beginning of the Republic. And so I want to tell you that story, starting with the Electoral College, which is one of these anti-democratic relics and remnants, a clearly obsolete mechanism within the Constitution that is stifling democracy that we are still wrestling with. And I want to talk to you about what I've been trying to do about it and what might be our way out. And from there, we will go to these other little systems of anti-democratic action that we will examine. But let's go back to the beginning and let's talk about the Electoral College. Now, of course, we couldn't have a popular vote for president because we didn't have a universal right to vote. So we hadn't defined the vote. In Article 1, what it says is that you have a right to vote for members of Congress if you are given the right to vote in the more populous body of your state legislature. So if you have the right to vote in the Maryland General Assembly for the House of Delegates, you would be given the right to participate in federal elections, which again means that it's up to the state to define who's part of the franchise and who not. Well, what about voting for president? Well, the people were completely cut out of that, according to the Constitution. It was up to the state legislatures under Article 2, Section 1 to devise a mechanism for providing for the appointment of the electors. And it was in the Electoral College, the assembly of these electors, that there would be a decision made as to who would become the president of the United States. And how would we determine the number of electors? Well, the number of electors would be equal to the number of representatives in your state plus the 2 for the US senators. So Maryland today, we have 8 representatives and we have 2 senators, so we have 10 electors. That's still the method for using the number of electors that the states get. What you'll notice there is that's a kind of admixture of 2 different mechanisms for representation. The House of Representatives is much closer to being based on a popular principle. We take a census every 10 years, which is defined in the Constitution. And then from the census, we decide how many US House seats each state will get. That in itself, though, does not give you an exact arithmetic, although there's got to be exactly the same number of voters in each district within a state. If you look between the states, there will be different numbers of people who are in the congressional district. So I represent a different number of people than Lisa Blunt Rochester, who represents the only House district in the state of Delaware, or Jennifer Wexton in Virginia, there's going to be differences among the states, but generally that's more of a popular principle. The US Senate seats, of course, are allotted just according to the states. So tiny Delaware or Wyoming each get 2 senators, and so does California, and so does New York. So a person voting in Delaware or in Wyoming or Vermont has a lot more power over a Senate seat than somebody voting in California or New York, where you've got 60 or 70 million people voting. But in any event, that was the so-called Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, between the big states and the small states. The small states fought for a Senate that operated on that 2 senators per state principle, which has clearly inflated in the Senate the power of the smaller states. And the big states fought for representation in the House on this mostly popular principle. Now, the very first question of political controversy to present itself is, well, what do you do with this large population of enslaved African-American people in the southern and mid-Atlantic states? More than 1 million people were brought in. Now, for all other purposes, of course, the southern states, who were controlled overwhelmingly by the slave masters, took the position that the slaves should not count. They should not be counted for all other purposes. But for these purposes, the slave master said, well, of course they should count. We should count the 1 million enslaved African Americans and make them part of the population base for awarding US House seats, for determining how many members of Congress would come from each state. In other words, they wanted to use the existence of this very large population of disenfranchised and disempowered people, who of course couldn't run for office and couldn't vote for office, but they wanted to use them to increase the numbers of representatives coming from North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia and Alabama and Maryland and Virginia and so on. The northern states, which were not all abolitionists, but were far more skeptical of the slave power, the power that the southern states were building on the backs of enslaved people. They took the position that if you're not going to allow the enslaved Americans, African Americans, to vote, and if you're not going to allow them to run for office, why should they count for the purposes of allotting representatives among the states? And so there's a tug of war between the two sides of it. The irony, of course, being today, when we talk about the 3/5 compromise and everybody sees how corrupt and obscene that is, people think that it was the North that wanted the enslaved African Americans to count, and it was the South that didn't. It was quite the reverse. It was the southern states, the states that would become the Confederate states, who were demanding that they count, and the northern states saying that's ridiculous, they shouldn't count, you're just trying to increase the power of the slave masters. And that was how they arrived at the so-called infamous 3/5 compromise, where the North said, okay, we will allow you to count 60% of the slave population. And this is the 3/5 compromise. And the critical words of the last 6 words there, 3/5 of all other persons, which was the oblique and indirect way of referring to the enslaved population that was there. So representatives and taxes apportioned among the states according to their numbers, determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, that's the indentured servants, and excluding Indians not taxed. They were just written out of it completely, 3/5 of all other persons. Well, what happened? Well, after the very first census was taken in 1800, and you had the famous presidential election of 1800, and we'll have to get back together sometime where I can get into that more deeply because we don't have time to totally get into it. But it was a fascinating election because you had Thomas Jefferson against John Adams. And there were kind of cross-cutting political currents. On the one hand, Adams, for the Federalists, was with Alexander Hamilton and the more conservative business mercantile interests that wanted to see a more centralized pro-business government that would spearhead economic development across the country, whereas the Jeffersonian Madison party was, and Aaron Burr party was fighting for more democracy, but with one big exception. They were not for democracy for enslaved African Americans. It was the Federalist Party which tilted more towards the liberation or the eventual abolition of slavery and the liberation of the slaves, whereas the Jefferson-Madison Party, although it was arguing for a more small d democratic constitution, had a huge blind spot for slavery. So when the census and reapportionment took place under the 3/5 compromise, it added a dozen US House seats to the southern states, including Maryland and Virginia. And Maryland here I'm including with the southern states for these purposes because it was shamefully a slave state. And so there was slavery there. But with the addition of the slave population, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, all these southern states added to their congressional delegations a dozen more people coming, all of them, of course, very fiercely pro-slavery, most of them slave masters themselves who got in. Now, how did that affect the Electoral College? Well, remember what the formula is for determining the number of electors your state gets. It's the number of representatives plus the 2 for the senators. So it's going to be constant for the 2, but we've just added a dozen, or by some counts 13 or 14, but at least a dozen presidential electors for the southern states. And this is what was called in that election where Jefferson ended up beating Adams. That was what was called the slave power, the power that the southern states got based on the 3/5 compromise and the extra members of Congress and the extra presidential electors that came in. Well, what did that do to American politics? Well, check this out. 4 out of our 5 first presidents were slave masters from Virginia. Okay, so that's Washington, skip Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. 7 of our first 10 presidents were slave masters, either from Virginia mostly or from a couple of other states. And that Southern pro-slavery arithmetic to the Electoral College has lasted all the way up to today. Now, I'm not going to be able to tell you the whole story today, but for those of you interested in this or any of the other topics I'm going to talk about, check out my book called Overruling Democracy: The Supreme Court versus the American People, which is about the collaboration of the Supreme Court with right-wing, racist, reactionary politics throughout American history. But look at what happens. The slave power dominates in Congress. It dominates in the Senate, especially, where the power of the smaller slave states, because they are smaller, the South Carolinas and the Georgias and the Alabamas, compared to New York, Ohio, even back in those days, Maine, Pennsylvania, the more populous states were the northern states. The smaller states, population-wise, especially if you include just the white population that could vote, were the southern states, and yet they had 2 senators equal, and it became a tradition very quickly in the southern states never to dethrone a U.S. senator. So those southern U.S. senators were staying in office for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. That was something that lasted up into my lifetime with people like Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms. The idea was basically you get those senators in, they stay forever. They've got the filibuster to defeat civil rights legislation. Let them stay in and get more seniority so they can control the committees to prevent civil rights legislation from coming out anywhere. But that in itself is a whole other story we got to talk about sometime. But in presidential elections, look what happens in the 20th century when there begins to be civil rights movement forward again after, a 75-year pause at the end of Reconstruction. And Reconstruction was only really allowed to happen because the racist governments of the South were kept out of Congress. And so radical Reconstruction could pass under, Republican rule, radical Republican rule in the Congress and with Republican presidents like Ulysses S. Grant. But after the end of Reconstruction, when the Union troops were pulled out of the South and the racist Redeemer governments were reinstated, the white supremacist governments were reinstated, the system of Jim Crow and lynching and racial violence lasted all the way up until our friend Bob Moses went down to Mississippi and John Lewis went down to Mississippi and they created the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But this was a system of quasi-slavery, which Wall Street Journal reporter Douglas Blackman calls slavery by another name, in a remarkable book you can check out if you're interested in that period that lasted between the end of Reconstruction and the coming of the civil rights movement in the 20th century. But in the 20th century, what I want to tell you is that every time that there was civil rights motion forward within the Democratic Party, our party within the Democratic Party, somebody from the South would leave the Democratic Party and run for president as an independent. Harry Byrd did that from Virginia. Strom Thurmond did it. Jesse Helms did it. George Wallace did it from Alabama. And they would take 30 or 40 Electoral College votes away from the Democrats. Now, those racist Dixiecrats, they called them, they hated the Republican Party because the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. And they were put into this very broad and somewhat bizarre coalition in the Democratic Party that grew up out of the New Deal from the Roosevelts, who were progressive thinking about civil rights, but were very ginger about how far they could go because they knew that they had to deal with these racist Dixiecrats in the South. It was SNCC, it was Bob Moses, it was Ivan O. Donaldson, it was John Lewis, it was Marion Barry. These were the people that forced the Democratic Party to choose by breaking it open at the Atlantic City Convention in 1964. And by 1968, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Democratic Party had become the party of civil rights progress, African Americans across the country, progressives, and the Republicans began to play the so-called Southern card or Southern strategy or race card, where they said, we're going to get all of those traditional racist Dixiecrats that always used to hate the Republican Party, we're going to turn them into Republicans. And that is the Republican Party of today that you guys are all dealing with, and you're going to be dealing with for a long time. Let's hope not the rest of your lives. But the point is that those candidates, George Wallace, a Democrat, the governor of Alabama, Harry Byrd, a Democrat from Virginia, they all left the Democratic Party to run as independents to send a sharp signal and message to our party about the price of moving towards civil rights. They're basically saying, we put our racism and our white supremacy first before the Democratic Party and the other objectives of the Democratic Party to have, a strong middle class and a strong working class and labor power and protect the environment and women's suffrage. We put ahead of all of that stuff, racism and white supremacy. And those people left our party and became the Republicans. And that's the party that you see there today. Well, what does all this mean for the Electoral College? Well, the Electoral College is a relic. It is obsolete. It doesn't work for us anymore. It has given us, depending on how you count, 4 or 5 popular vote losers in American history as president. And we got one for this, Maddie. 2 of the last 5 elections, the popular vote loser, George W. Bush in 2000 and Donald Trump in 2016, won the election. Okay. Bush was defeated by Gore by more than 500,000 votes. Hillary beat Trump by more than 3 million votes. Okay, and both of them, under the most suspicious circumstances, were able to eke out these electoral college victories. So I want to make three major arguments against the electoral college. One is that it doesn't make sense that the popular vote losers should win the election, or putting it in the obverse way, that the popular vote winners should lose the election. That's one. Number two, because it can all come down to one state, like it did in 2000 in Florida, or the way it did in Ohio, or one or two other states in 2016 for Trump. It invites the kind of strategic corruption and mischief that we are seeing running rampant in the electoral process today. Because if you can win the vote in Florida in 2000 by 539 votes, I'm not saying 539,000 votes, I'm saying 539 votes is what they were able to squeak out a victory with by disenfranchising every former prisoner in the state, which was over 1 million people, by closing and moving polling places, and by throwing more than 17,000 people off the rolls by the Secretary of State because their names resembled those of felons. These are non-felons, but kicking those people off the rolls, you can steal the election. And, our elections are very vulnerable. We don't have what the vast majority of democratic countries have, like in Canada or Mexico. Mexico's got an electoral Supreme Court whose entire job is to get ready for the next election and to make sure that the election works. In Canada, there is a national election commission, nonpartisan, independent, which is just working to make sure that everybody's going to have the right to vote, that the registration rolls are clean, that there's no corruption, there's no confusion, there's no disinformation. What do we have in America? Well, we've got, depending on how you count it, at least 51 different electoral jurisdictions. But really, when you get down to the county and city level, thousands of different electoral jurisdictions with different ballots and different electoral counting systems. And we have no national electoral commission intended to run the whole thing. No, what we've got is politicians doing it. In Florida, when Bush squeaked out that most dubious of victories over Al Gore in Florida, the person in charge of the elections was Catherine Harris, the Secretary of State, who was also the chair of the George Bush for President campaign in 2000 in the state of Florida. I kid you not. You gotta, if you haven't read about the 2000 election, and I know that was before a lot of you guys were born, but I remember it like it was yesterday. The person who was in charge of guaranteeing the fairness and accuracy of the vote was the same person who was running the Bush for President campaign in Florida. Okay, so the second point, therefore, I want to make is that the Electoral College is inviting and producing corruption and electoral mischief, okay? And the third point, and this is perhaps the most important one, the Electoral College today operates in such a way that the vast majority of people are excluded from the real election. What do I mean by that? Well, the vast majority of us live in safe blue states or safe red states. Okay, so Maryland, everybody knows, is a safe blue state. Will Joe Biden come and campaign in Maryland? Almost certainly not. Will Kamala Harris come and campaign here? Almost certainly not. And people will beg them and we'll say we want them and everything. But if you think of it the way a campaign manager thinks of it, why would they waste 1 minute here unless they can maybe come to a very fancy fundraiser and make a lot of money? But basically, they're going to avoid Maryland because it's blue, just like they're going to avoid a couple other dozen states because they're blue. Why would they go to Delaware, which is blue? Why would they go to Massachusetts? Why would they go to California? Why would they go to New York? Why would they go to Hawaii? But similarly, why would they go to safe red states? Why would they go to South Carolina? Why would they go to Alabama? Why would they go to Alaska? Why would they go to Texas or Louisiana? Why would they go to Kansas or Missouri? And it's the exact same thing for the Republican candidates. Now, I know, it's hard to use Donald Trump in a hypothetical because it's so deranged, but why would any rational Republican candidate spend any time in a state where they know they're going to get the electors, or where they know they're not going to get the electors? So where do you go? You go to the swing states. And we know what those swing states are. There are never more than 9 or 10 of them. I think we've got them up there. This is a little map that Maddie found showing where campaign money goes. So money's raised from all over the country, but then it's put into TV ads in just the swing states. Florida, Virginia, which was swing this is, I guess, 2012. Okay. North Carolina, Colorado, Iowa, Nevada, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, Michigan. And it's true that sometimes, a state becomes a swing state when it wasn't. When I was growing up, Virginia was about as red as it gets. Today, it's a swing state. So that's good for Virginia. But what about the 80% of the states that are clearly red or blue? Well, they're not getting TV ads. They're not getting candidate appearances. When I was the co-chair of the Obama for President campaign back in 2008, and I remember it very well because most of the top officials in the state, Senator Mikulski then, Senator Cardin, Governor O'Malley, they were all with Hillary Clinton. And I had met Barack through Professor Tribe, who was his constitutional law professor, and my constitutional law professor and my friend. And so we'd met, and I, fell in love with the guy. And so I became co-chair of the Obama campaign. Well, what do you want as the chair of the campaign? You want signs, you want bumper stickers, you want all that stuff. And I remember very clearly getting the call from the campaign saying, no, we're not sending you any signs. We're not sending you any stickers. All of that goes to Virginia. And by the way, while we're at it, all the volunteers that you get for the Obama campaign, we want you to send them to Virginia, which we did. And we sent thousands of people down there. And we want you to send money down there. And of course, that is the logic of the system. But look at it from the standpoint of Maryland. We want to be building our party. We want to be getting people involved in our politics, not sending everybody to Winchester, Virginia, or Enrico County or what have you. We're going to do it because we want to win and because we're loyal blue, troops here. But from a structural standpoint, that's a terrible way to run a presidential election because it underutilizes and it undernourishes the grassroots in every other state, in all the other states. So what to do about it? Well, the very first bill I introduced when I got into the Maryland State Senate was for a national popular vote interstate compact. And the idea was simple. The idea is we get as many states together to enter into an agreement where we say we will use our powers under Article 2 of the Constitution to appoint our electors, not for the winner in Maryland, or not for the winner in Oregon or in New Jersey or South Carolina, but for the winner nationally. So we will add up the popular votes from across the country that are reported by all the secretaries of states. Whoever wins, we will cast our electors for. That will be a way that we will bypass the current fragmented, corruptible Electoral College system. And we'll get to a national popular vote. It's similar to what the states did prior to the passage of the 17th Amendment, which gave us direct election of U.S. senators. It's a lot of states would say, well, it's up to the legislature to pick a U.S. senator, but we're going to conduct a popular election. We will be bound by what the people decide. It's also like what the states did before the passage of the 19th Amendment. In women's suffrage, a lot of states said, well, before the Constitution changes, we will change the Constitution of, whatever the state might be, New Jersey or Illinois or whatever, to give women the right to vote. So what we're saying is, all right, ultimately we should amend the Constitution, but that's a tall order. It's a 2/3 vote in the House, 2/3 vote in the Senate, 3/4 of the states have got to ratify. But before that, what we'll do is we'll create this interstate coalition. Look who's in it now, up here: California, Colorado, Connecticut, DC, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, all the way down to the bottom. You will notice that those are blue states. It is Democrats who overwhelmingly support getting rid of the Electoral College and instituting a national popular vote. We should elect the president the way we elect governors, the way we elect mayors, members of Congress, senators. Whoever gets the most votes wins. That's it. You know, when I was fighting for the national popular vote legislation in Maryland, sometimes people would come up to me and say, you know, you're making all these arguments about democracy, but who's this really going to help, the Democrats or Republicans? And I said, there's no trick to it. It's going to help whichever party gets the most votes. That's it. You know, it's a majority rule system. So that's what we're fighting for. I hope you guys all check out the National Popular Vote campaign. Tell people that's what we're for. We're for a national popular vote for president, not this decrepit antique of an electoral college, which is being used to promote corruption and malleability in the process, and is bypassing the vast majority of the people. We know that the Republicans understand that they are the unpopular party. They are the limited and shrinking party, and a popular vote is going to go for us for reasons I'll talk about in a minute. But we've got to fight this as a matter of principle. We've moved away from a lot of the undemocratic parts of the original Constitution, the exclusion of women, the exclusion of African Americans, the exclusion of people without wealth and property, the indirect selection of U.S. senators by the legislatures, and so on. This is the next logical step. We've got to have a popular vote for president. All right. Next, let's go to the next question. I'm going to move much more quickly here. The gerrymandering of districts. This is a scandal. Everybody understands it. This is how the politicians choose their voters before the voters choose the politicians. It's how the Republicans have gerrymandered themselves into power in lots of states across the country, including Ohio, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, right up until 2018, when the Florida Supreme Court struck down the outrageous GOP gerrymander of the congressional and state legislative districts under the state constitution. So it didn't have to go up to the U.S. Supreme Court because they're what we call an independent and adequate state ground. So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court struck it down. Look what happened. If I'm not mistaken, there were 12 congressional districts in PA before. 9 of them were controlled by Republicans, 3 by Democrats. They basically packed every Democrat in the state into 3 districts and guaranteed Republican majorities and all the rest. And they built in a state that was at best 50-50, but really more of a pro-Democratic state where you had Democratic governors and attorney general and secretary of state and U.S. senators and so on. But it was, you know, pretty close. But in any event, they had 9 Republican seats in the U.S. House delegation and 3 Democratic seats. After the Pennsylvania Supreme Court redrew the map, we now have 6 and 6. Is that right? Yeah, it was
9 and 9.
Yeah, right. I'm sorry. It was 12 to 6 before. It was 12 to 6. It was 2-1, and then now it's 9 and 9. Okay, so there were 12 Republicans and 6 Democrats, a 2-1 split in a basically 50-50 state. Okay, after the Florida Supreme Court redrew it, now it's 9-9. But look at these other states. Look at North Carolina, which is another 50-50 state, where Democrats are as likely to win for governor, as they have a governor now, as Republicans. Well, 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats. Ohio, a 50-50 state, 3-1 split, 12 Republicans in the U.S. House delegation, 4 Democrats. And Wisconsin, which is definitely a more Democratic state, where Democrats are more likely to win statewide elections for, you name it, 5 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And that's because the Republicans control the legislatures and they cut themselves in. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, don't the Democrats do that too? Didn't the Democrats do that in Maryland? Well, absolutely. And it's just as lopsided and disproportionate and wrong in Maryland, where we have 8 seats and 7 of them are Democratic seats and just one, the first district, which includes the Eastern District, but also includes parts of Western Maryland that have been drawn in from across the state. So it becomes a 7-to-1 split for the Democrats. That's disproportionate too. So what's the difference? Well, the main difference is the Democrats recognize this is wrong, and we're trying to get out of it. And we passed H.R. 1 to end partisan gerrymandering, to mandate the use of independent, nonpartisan redistricting commissions in every state for the drawing of both congressional and state legislative districts. The other difference is that there are just a lot more states where the Republicans have been able to entrench and perpetuate their historic control. So when you go back to look at Wisconsin, Ohio, and North Carolina, this is one of the danger flashpoints for 2020, because we are going to win the popular vote for the electors in those states. We don't have a national popular vote right now, and we're going to win in those states, which means we should get the electors from those states. But one of the things we're afraid of is that the state legislatures, which are in Republican hands in North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Ohio, will throw up some kind of fake news, mailmen were voting for the people they serve, or a non-citizen voted in Madison, or what have you, and they'll say we're going to disregard the popular vote and just cast the electors for Trump. That's one of the things that we've got to watch out for. But in any event, if and when we take back the House, we take back the Senate, we have a Democratic president, we're going to get rid of partisan gerrymandering. There's a whole other interesting conversation we're going to have another time about what you get rid of it with. But when you start with an independent, nonpartisan redistricting panel, at the very least, you don't get politicians drawing their own districts. Now, the further discussion that needs to be had is about the fact that single-member districts themselves are part of the problem. And one easy way of thinking about that is if you have a state that's like 60% Democrat and 40% Republican, Maryland is some kind of vague facsimile of that. If you have each district reincarnate a 60-40 split, the 60% party is going to get 100% of the seats. So even a 55-45 split, if you evenly spread a 55-45 advantage in 8 or 10 or 40 congressional districts, which is kind of California, you're going to come back with like 100%. And I don't think we want 100% of the people from Massachusetts being Democrats and 100% of the people from Kentucky being Republicans. So what do you want? Well, I think what you want is something more like proportional representation. If you've got 55% of the vote, you should get 55% of the seats. And if you got 35% of the vote, you should get 35% of the seats. And if you've got 20% of the vote, you should get 20% of the seats, as opposed to 0%. But that will require the use of multi-member districts, kind of like what we have in Maryland for the delegate races, and the use of a proportional representation system. And there are lots of different systems that are out there to advance proportional representation. And we'll make sure you guys get educated on that. But I do think that is going to be the next wave of dialogue. But we certainly have got to get away from politicians drawing their own districts, which has been a critical impediment to democratization in the country and a critical life support for Republican minority control. All right, let's go now to talk about the next thing, which is statehood. We've talked about it before, so I don't want to get into it in too much detail, but I will tell you that, look, statehood is the method by which political communities in America achieve equality, constitutional, political, and economic and financial equality with the rest of the country. We began with 13 states, as you know. We've added 37 states since then. All of them have been added under what's on the screen, Article 4 of the Constitution, which says that Congress can admit new states to the Union. So look at what we've got with DC and Puerto Rico, if you put that one up, Maddie. Very large populations here, right? Puerto Rico is larger than 15 or 20 states in population. It would have 4 members of the US House of Representatives. Of course, Puerto Rico is part of the United States. It is a territory of the United States. Those are all US citizens we're talking about there. The District of Columbia has more than 700,000 people, not as big as Puerto Rico, but it's bigger than 2 states right now that have 4 senators, Vermont and Wyoming, 1 red state and 1 blue state. And so we are fighting for the admission of DC under Congress's powers under Article 4. Now, it's being said that it's unconstitutional because of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution, which says that Congress shall exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square is made by session of particular states, and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all other places like arsenals, forts, magazines, and so on. All right, so what does this tell us? Well, actually, Congress has the power under Article 1 because we have exclusive legislation, which means exclusive legislative jurisdiction and decision-making. Since we've got exclusive plenary power over the district, we can decide to shrink and reduce the borders of the district, and then to cede the population somewhere else. And how do we know we can do that? Because Congress did it back in 1846, and under very different historical circumstances. The original District of Columbia was exactly 10 miles square. It couldn't be larger than that. But a square was drawn that included areas north of the Potomac that were in Maryland and areas south of the Potomac in Virginia. That was Alexandria, Arlington, and Fairfax County. That was part of Washington, D.C. Well, the slave masters, as the sectarian conflict over slavery heated up, the slave masters feared that Congress would abolish the slave traffic in the District of Columbia, which Abraham Lincoln had been agitating for back since the 1840s. He was only in the House of Representatives, but he was in the House of Representatives, I'm proud to say, for a term. And the main legislation he was fighting for was the abolition of the slave traffic in DC. He was so scandalized that in the land that is now where the Supreme Court is, there were slave auctions taking place there. And of course, slave labor was used to build the Capitol itself. So anyway, Lincoln, much to his credit and honor, was fighting for that. A lot of the slave masters from Virginia feared this was coming, and they asked Congress, a pro-slavery Congress, to return Alexandria, Fairfax County, and Arlington to Virginia. And they did. They shrank the seat of government and ceded the population and the lands to Virginia. Well, if Congress can do that for the slave masters in the 19th century, it can do it to free the current population of Washington, D.C., of 700,000 tax-paying, law-abiding, draftable U.S. citizens for the purposes of giving them their political equality and their rights. And the price is too high of the current colonial situation. People in D.C. were cheated out of $750 million by the Republicans in the Senate in the CARES Act. That's how much money they should have gotten if they were a state, and even being treated as though they were a state, which was the way they were supposed to be treated. But the Republicans decided to rip them off $750 million in the middle of a plague, in the middle of a public health crisis. And then, of course, we saw the absolute contempt advertised by Attorney General Barr and Donald Trump when they decided to unleash that secret police force on more than 2,000 protesters, many of them Washingtonians, with tear gas, rubber bullets, and pepper spray, crushing everybody's First Amendment rights along the way. So Donald Trump could go ahead and broadcast the most grotesque photo opportunity of American history at the St. John's Church, which they crashed. All right, so statehood for DC, Washington, D.C., which stands for Douglas Commonwealth, statehood for the people of Puerto Rico. We'll have to have another discussion about that because Not everybody is completely with the program yet, but I think most people are. Most people see that Puerto Rico needs it just like DC needs it. I mean, Donald Trump basically threw them some Scott paper towels during Hurricane Maria and called it a day. They got ripped off hundreds of millions of dollars they should have had. They also are not represented in Congress. They have no say on war and peace, federal budget, federal laws, criminal justice reform. Imagine what a transformation it will be for the country when we have two senators from Washington, D.C., two senators from Puerto Rico. So, all right, from there, we want to talk about, let's see, Maddie, forgive me, what was next on our list? I was going to talk about
felony disenfranchisement.
Felony disenfranchisement. Let me just say very quickly, because we don't have a constitutional right to vote, guaranteeing every person the right to vote and the right to be represented, and it continues to be up to the states. The Supreme Court said in a case called Richardson versus Ramirez that felons could be disenfranchised. They viewed that as the implicit meaning of the Constitution, where it says that states can have their congressional delegations reduced in size if they disenfranchise people except for prisoners, felons, and that has been read. I don't think it's logically necessary, but it has been read as giving implied permission for the disenfranchisement of prisoners. That was one of the very first things I worked on when I became a state senator in Maryland. I campaigned on restoring the vote to former prisoners. When I got elected in 2006, took office in 2007, we had Mississippi's law. We had Alabama's law. When you got out of prison, you got every other right restored to you except the right to vote in Maryland. You needed to get a gubernatorial commutation and pardon in order to vote. And so I went to see the state senator who'd been working on this, Gwendolyn Britt from Prince George's County. I said, Gwen, I campaigned on this. If there's any way I can help, let me know. And she came back to me 3 weeks later, and I can never forget this because I still had not spoken on the Senate floor before, and it's a very big deal. The first time you speak, it's like the first time you talk in class or whatever, and everybody's very nervous. But she came back to me and she said, we got the ex-felon voting rights bill out of committee, and we're going to bring it to the floor, and we want you to be the floor leader. And I said, oh my God, Gwen, I'm so honored and delighted and thrilled and surprised. And she said, well, don't be that honored. You're the only white senator willing to do it. And I was like, all right, well, I'll take it however I can get it. And so the Republicans got up and they started railing at us, and they said, the Democrats want to give the right to vote back to murderers, rapists, armed robbers, arsonists, and kind of read down the whole list of felonies. And Gwen, who sat in front of me, turned around. She said, okay, it's your turn. You can get up now. But I had an argument for them. And I got up and I said that the vast majority of people who are in prison in Maryland today, unlike the people you're talking about, the murderers and terrorists and so on, are never going to get out of prison. The vast majority of people are in for nonviolent offenses. And I said, take one of my constituents, for example, Jack Abramoff. Now, I don't know if you guys know who Jack Abramoff is, but he was a corrupt Republican lobbyist who was convicted basically of trying to buy people off. And I said, if anybody should be disenfranchised for life, it's somebody like Jack Abramoff, who's just gone off to federal prison in Western Maryland for 6 years. But on our side of the aisle, we do believe that the purpose of punishment is rehabilitation. And so we'll stand up for the voting rights of even a hardened ex-felon like Jack Abramoff. And so we ended up passing it that day, I was proud to say, and we re-enfranchised 88,000 people after the House did it. But we still got millions more around the country who can't vote. And even in Florida, where the people voted like we did, they voted in a referendum to restore voting rights to everybody. The Republicans very cleverly said, okay, we're not going to take away their right to vote because we can't. The state constitution's been amended, but we're going to say you can't vote if you're a former prisoner until you've repaid the state for your period of confinement. We're going to charge you rent or like a hotel room for the time that you spent in prison. thereby completely nullifying the re-enfranchisement of that vote. And remember, Bush beat Gore there by 539 votes. And there are more than 1 million people carrying felony convictions. So we're talking about serious voter suppression and strategic manipulation of the vote. All right, and let me just close this part by saying the mechanisms for voter repression, suppression, depression constantly mutate. They change all the time. And this year, of course, we're seeing this appalling attack on the post office to thwart voting by mail. I think we got a list of some of the different ones up there. These are all things we're fighting: purging voting rolls, closing polling places, relocating polling places without telling people, changing the hours, making it more difficult to register, and on and on and on. All of these things are part of the fight to vote in America. But you can see that we live with this terrible cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, we all think that what it means to be American is to have the right to vote, get to exercise your voice. And on the other side, it has been made recurrently and intensely difficult to vote. And millions and millions and millions of people have been and continue to be disenfranchised all the time. This has got to be number one on the agenda when we get back into power in 2021. We have got to make sure that we amend the Constitution to give everybody the right to vote, that we enact statehood for the communities that are submitting statehood petitions, that we pass the Voting Rights Act to get rid of all of these mechanisms, that we deal with the Electoral College once and for all, either through the national popular vote or by amending the Constitution if we've got the power to do it. So keep your eyes on the prize. We've got to make sure that we are expanding and deepening democracy as we go. As you can tell, these things are complex, they're complicated. You guys have all got to become masters of each and every one of these issues so you can explain it to other people, and so you can teach people about how we need to continue to move forward. And I'm sorry I've talked too long. It's taken exactly an hour, but I will hang around for another, whatever we got, 15 or 20 minutes in order to take questions. And this final slide I wanted to show you just was that in 16, we beat the Republicans by 3 million votes. In 18, we beat, if you add up all the congressional races, we beat the Republicans by 9 million votes. My friends, we are going to have a popular victory of 12, maybe 15 million votes. They know it. Donald Trump has no positive campaign, no positive agenda. He's not talking about what he wants to do in his second term. What's his campaign? His campaign is trying to pull out every trick in the book to keep people from voting and to keep people's votes from being counted or delivered. That's the entire campaign right now. We've got to let America see that, and we've got to make sure that the majority wins, which means our majority's got to be a super duper super majority. We got to beat them by 15 or 20 million votes. We got to beat them in mail-in balloting. We got to beat them in absentee balloting. We got to beat them in early voting, and we got to beat them on the actual day of the election so that they have no way of trying to overthrow the majority will here. All right, that's my presentation to you guys, my dear Democracy Summer Fellows. And the floor is open for questions or ideas.
Thank you, Congressman. Our first question is from Amy. Amy, if you want to unmute and introduce yourself.
Hi, Congressman. Thank you for coming to speak to us. My name is Amy, and my question is, how can we reconcile the systemically racist past and present of the U.S. and move on forward and do better by BIPOC members? And may I add on, especially in terms of the Constitution, since you mentioned the 3/5 compromise and further like the loophole in the 13th Amendment?
Thank you for that great question, Amy. You know, I honestly think you guys are doing it, your generation. I mean, when I went to the Black Lives Matter protests to see large multiracial crowds with young people such as yourselves getting up and speaking, what you guys are doing in Democracy Summer on a consciously multiracial, multi-ethnic basis to organize people together to make these improvements at every level of government. And I'm glad you're onto the Constitution, because it's mostly the right wing that talks about constitutional amendments. You know, they want a balanced budget amendment. They want school prayer amendment. They want a human life amendment against abortion and so on. We got to be talking about the amendments that we want in the Constitution. We want an amendment to repeal the Electoral College and guarantee the right of everybody to vote and to be represented at every level of government. We want a constitutional amendment for fair, equal education funding across the country, right? In other words, we've got to be talking about the constitutional changes we need. At the same time, we're moving forward at the congressional level, at the state level, at the local level. So, you know, my bias as a professor has always been education. Just give people the means of making their own decision. Madison said, those who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. That's why I'm giving you, I think, the most precious gift I could give you, which is my knowledge and my best understanding of where America is right now and the things that we need to do to keep moving forward. Because all the other stuff we've talked about this summer, we've talked about climate change, and we talked about criminal justice reform, and we talked about national health care, and I brought you my best friends to come in to talk about this stuff. But it's not going to happen if we don't have a democratic infrastructure that allows the popular will to be heard and to be translated. If the Republicans can continue to manipulate everything by their minority control over the Electoral College, gerrymandering, and you know, in just in the interest of time, I didn't even get into Citizens United and corporate money in our politics, which is, you know, yet another problem. So keep organizing, keep educating. That's the key.
Thanks, Amy. Our next question is from Luca.
Hi, my name is Luca. Thank you, Congressman Raskin, for coming and speaking to us. I think you kind of answered like some parts of my question, and it's a pretty simple question, but how can those of us who cannot vote in the upcoming election tackle the democracy deficit and make up for the large portion of the electorate that chooses not to cast their vote? And I'm kind of looking for things like other than like joining campaigns and phone banking and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, great question, Luca. I mean, we're not going to be able to make any of these structural changes before the election, of course, because, I mean, we make a lot of noise in the House and we're organizing, but remember, we are 1/2 of 1/3 of the federal government, right? So you get the legislative branch, we get the House and the Senate, so we got half of that. Then the Republicans have the White House and the entire executive branch, and they basically control the judiciary now, too. I mean, sometimes we can get a half decent decision, like in the gay rights decision, because, you know, but basically they are in control. So we need to take everything back. I want you guys to come up with some creative ideas. I mean, you know, since a lot of you can't vote yet, can you make lists of, you know, 50 family members and friends who can vote, who you will take responsibility for just bugging the hell out of until they tell you that they voted? And we, you know, Paul and Maddie and everybody, we've got to come up with we should have a form that we come up with for the election on everybody's 2020 election game plan. I am going to vote by what? I'm going to vote by absentee ballot. I'm going to send in, you know, my ballot by such and such time, where I'm going to vote early by going to such and such. I mean, everybody needs a plan. This is not easy, right? This is not now anymore like, you know, going to McDonald's where there's one on every block and you just show up and buy your French fries. They're making it really difficult. And so we need, you know, you guys can help us by making sure that everybody's got an election day strategy for making sure their ballot is in, hopefully long before election day, but at least by then. Thank you, Luca.
All right, do we have time for another question or two?
Yeah, sure.
Great. Laurel, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, Congressman Raskin. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. My question is, one reason that people often cite for not getting rid of the Electoral College is that it's a tradition. Why does the idea of tradition become so ingrained in our political systems?
Well, that might just be a matter of human nature. I mean, I think there are some traditions that people stick to that they love, right? I mean, how many of us love Thanksgiving or love, so there's not, the problem is an uncritical embrace of tradition. And we also have a tradition of discriminating against gay people. We have a tradition of discriminating against disabled people, right? And there's obviously been, I mean, our most deeply rooted traditions are in the political process of discriminating against African Americans and women and people with that. So that should be enough to discredit the idea that you just blindly follow tradition. But here's another way of looking at it. America spends tens of millions of dollars every year exporting belief in democracy and voting, right? I mean, I tremble to think of what Trump has done to that and what they're actually talking to people about, since all of his friends are the great authoritarians of the world, like Vladimir Putin and Viktor Orban in Hungary. But we spend all this money telling people to go the democratic way, have elections and promote democracy. You know what we never export? We never even try to export? The Electoral College, right? All of these countries whose constitutions we're helping with and that are coming over to our side, they're electing presidents the way that every other country elects presidents, not the way we do it. They don't say, you really got something there with that Electoral College, which nobody understands and which nobody can defend, and is completely irrational and is totally malleable and susceptible to corruption. It doesn't make any sense anymore. I mean, most Americans don't understand it and can't explain how it works. You guys are in a tiny group already. People can at least explain where it comes from and why it works this way. So I would just say to people, I'll give you 3 reasons we should get rid of the Electoral College. The winner of the most votes should win the election, like every other election. 2, there's all this corruption that comes out of it because you can steal an election just by moving votes or suppressing votes in one state. And 3, most of us are left out of the presidential campaign, right? Give me 3 arguments for the Electoral College. I guarantee you, I'd be amazed if they come up with one other than tradition. Thanks for that wonderful question. Say hi to my friends in Frederick County too.
I will, thank you.
Okay, Kayla is our next question.
Hi, I'm Kayla, and I was wondering, do you think that Trump's administration has a new danger to democracy, or do you think that his administration has just been able to expose dangerous weaknesses that were already present in our current government and society?
But I heard the second half, Kayla, but I didn't hear the first half. Will you say it again? It was like A or B. What was A? Do you think
Trump's administration has been a new danger to democracy?
Okay. If I'm hearing you right, and the sound's not coming through perfectly, but basically you're saying, does he pose a new danger, or is this just this old danger in a new guise? I think the answer is both. In other words, what we're seeing is the Republican Southern strategy, stealing white supremacy and racism away from the old Democratic Party. We're seeing this bear fruit in really brutal, vicious ways, like, the march in Charlottesville and, his country club supporters yelling white power from the golf cart and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that really is continuous with our history. And I think that both Bob Moses and Reverend Barber told us that. I mean, that we, don't think of Donald Trump as, some guy who just appeared out of thin air. I mean, he's the product of a long definition of white supremacist politics. What's different now is that a majority of the country is totally opposed to it. And we have states that are majority non-white now. And so the demographics of the country have shifted broadly. They're clearly a minority force. But having said that there is this continuity, which is really important. And continuity, not just in terms of the white supremacy, but also in terms of the plutocracy, the use of money to try to control everybody else. But what is discontinuous, what's new, what's radically original and novel is his connection to fascist and authoritarian movements and governments around the world, and his willingness to sacrifice and target for destruction traditional American political institutions that we love, like the post office, like the census, like the separation of powers, important parts of the Constitution, the First Amendment, and so on. So yeah, I would say, unfortunately, I wish I could tell you we've seen it before, and this is just more of the same. It's not more of the same. If we don't beat them in this election, we are looking at serious right-wing authoritarianism in America. We're looking at a level of authoritarianism that this country has not seen basically since enslavement of African American people. And it has all of the modern technologies that are being used to control and surveil people. So it would be a real problem. We've got to do everything we can to win this election. Thanks for that question, Kayla.
Okay, Congressman, do you want to take one or two more?
Yeah, let's take one or two more. I'm so happy to get to spend some time with everybody.
In that case, our next question is from Aline.
Oh, hi, thank you for coming to speak to us. So my question is about Citizens United. A lot of people think that the best way to overturn Citizens United is through a constitutional amendment. And then there are other people who say that opening a constitutional convention for that would offer a way for right-wing people to overturn Roe v. Wade or other important decisions. So do you support a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United? If so, why? And if not, what would you say is a better option?
Yeah, well, I've definitely supported a constitutional amendment to overthrow Citizens United. But as you know, Lynn, thank you for that wonderful question. There are two different tracks you can go on to amend the Constitution. And one is it starts in Congress, and you get a 2/3 vote in the House, you get a 2/3 vote in the Senate. And then once it passes Congress, it's sent to the states, and 3/4 of the states need to ratify. That's how every other constitutional amendment since the original 10 has taken place, right? And those two were sent out in that way from Philadelphia. So the other way you go, though, is it begins with the states, and the states petition for the creation of another constitutional convention. We haven't had a second constitutional convention since Philadelphia, and people are afraid of it for the reasons that you state. People don't know whether you could get like some kind of right-wing faction that takes it over, and suddenly we're looking at repeal of equal protection and due process, and repeal of the 19th Amendment and crazy stuff like that. And so personally, I'm not so afraid of that. And I've been willing to support the call for a constitutional convention, basically, though, because there have been lots of calls for constitutional conventions before, but Congress always decides to act on an amendment before a convention comes forward. So if you had a bunch of states saying, let's have a constitutional convention to overturn Citizens United, if enough states got onto that, 25, 30, 35 states, before you actually had a convention, Congress would act on the underlying amendment. So I've been vaguely supportive of that. I understand the fears that people have of it. Again, I think that most Americans are on the progressive side. I think that it's the disproportionate number of states that are smaller states, but that have been captured by the Republicans, the North Dakotas and South Dakotas and Montanas and so on. And it is the Republican manipulation of the Electoral College, gerrymandering, and so on that has meant that our formal politics is way behind the thinking of the people. But we're getting there. And your generation is the one that is going to turn it all around. So don't be afraid of constitutional change. Don't be afraid of constitutional amendments. You know, we can debate whether there should be a constitutional convention or not. I'm not wed to it, but let's not be afraid of any of it. We can't be afraid of constitutional politics.
Thanks, Aline. So our last question is from Curran.
Hi, I'm Curran. And
Corin, hey.
Hi. So the one branch of government that is not up for re-election in this cycle is the Supreme Court. In fact, it is never up for re-election. And the Supreme Court also kind of has a history of gut punching both parties, but it is unlikely, unless Brett Kavanaugh is impeached, which he totally should be for like perjury, sexual assault, all that stuff, that the Supreme Court will become a left-leaning wing for probably a whole generation. And even then, it depends on who becomes president when I believe Alito and Clarence Thomas are the oldest members. So the scenario is we get our blue wave, we pass the Green New Deal, we pass HR 1, all this good stuff. It goes to the Supreme Court and Roberts says no. Furthermore, he decides, let's get rid of Roe v. Wade and let's solidify Rucho versus Common Cause. So how do we fight the branch of government that has no oversight?
Yeah, well, that's a great point, Kurt. I mean, and you're right. I mean, in the old days, the president that appointed you wasn't necessarily determinative of how you would operate on the court. I mean, a lot of my favorite justices, I love Sotomayor and Kagan, but traditionally, a lot of my favorite justices were Republican appointees. David Souter, great justice. John Paul Stevens, appointed by Gerald Ford. Earl Warren was a pretty great justice in a lot of ways. So, and there have been Democratic appointees who've really disappointed, like Byron White. So that part is true. The real problem is that for most of our history, the Supreme Court has been on the side of white supremacy, the propertied classes, corporate power, and conservatism. And we're back in one of those phases today. And you're right, there have been all of these illegitimate manipulations of the Supreme Court, like when McConnell just pronounced one day, oh, well, there's a vacancy, but this is the last year of Obama's presidency, so we're not going to have any hearings and we're not going to have a vote, and we're going to let the people decide. Well, of course, the people had decided by electing Obama before who was going to be nominated, and he nominated my constituent Merrick Garland, and he never got a hearing. Chief of the DC Circuit, a great judge. So we end up instead with another one of my constituents, the aforementioned Brett Kavanaugh of Georgetown Prep, well, you guys know all about Brett Kavanaugh and what he's made of and what these people are doing to the judiciary. So it's not true that there's nothing we can do about it. Of course, we can wait through attrition for the president, and let's hope that's Biden, knock on wood, for the president to nominate new justices who are going to be in line with the progressive values of the Constitution and equal protection and due process and the First Amendment and so on. But we also could alter the size of the Supreme Court. The Constitution does not say that there are 9 justices. The size of the Supreme Court has been altered 7 or 8 different times. So we could say, take, for example, the nightmare scenario that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has to leave over the next few months. And the same Republicans who said, we're not going to give you a hearing because it's a year before the election, suddenly decide we're going to ram through a Republican nominated to the Supreme Court in 30 days or something like that. Well, at that point, I think that kind of hardball would justify some hardball on our side, saying if we get in and we can increase the size of the Supreme Court, we're going to do it, because we're not going to have our constitutional rights defined into oblivion by a right-wing Supreme Court that was concocted by a bunch of Machiavellian con men, you know? So when reporters ask me, I say, everything's on the table. I would like to hear arguments on all sides. We don't need to talk about it right now because, you know, we might not even be in a position to do it. But when you look at the games that they've played, we've got to look at every means at our disposal to restore the trajectory of democratic progress in the country. I mean, another thing that can be done is you can take justices who are on the Supreme Court who are guaranteed a life tenure under the Constitution, but just life tenure doesn't mean necessarily on that court. So that we could rotate Supreme Court justices onto circuit courts or district courts, and you know, so there are different things that we can do. And being on the Judiciary Committee, I'm hoping that's something I get to look at. You want to do one more, Maddie?
Sure, we can do one more question.
I would keep going, but I've got all these hearings and stuff I've got to get to, and I got to respond to some reporters. So.
Sure. So how about Aiden? Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much for taking my question. So my question would be, so as you know, and you've talked about this today, so there are multiple options for abolishing the Electoral College, a constitutional amendment, but that of course does seem unlikely to happen, that Republicans would let that happen, or the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which, as you said, is the agreement between each state that they would give their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote rather than the state's popular vote. But that faces some legal challenges. So in your opinion, what path should we take in the immediate future to try to abolish the Electoral College?
Well, we got to stay on the national popular vote pathway. We are a majority of the way there. We have more than half of the Electoral College votes we need. We need to get 270 votes in the Electoral College coalition in order to establish it, because at that point, the will of the states in the compact would be binding, and so we would get, you know, the national popular vote effective every time. So we got to keep going and moving there to get it adopted in all the states. When you do public opinion polling, more than 80% of the people support it, and that is a majority not just of Democrats but of Republicans and independents too. And on so many issues, we see that dynamic, like on universal background check on violent criminals for gun purchases. That's favored by more than 90% of American people. That's not just Democrats, that's independents and Republicans too. So we've got to figure out a way to, you know, go to the people, including Republicans, without going through their propaganda channels, like Fox News and what the Republican leaders say, and make it happen. We've got to get it done in the next go round. Thank you for that great question. And I think I owe you a phone call too.
Great. I think that was our last question.
All right. Well, Maddie, let me bid everybody farewell. Again, if you want to read more deeply into this stuff, I've written a bunch of articles, especially on the Supreme Court stuff, you can find on the People for American Way website. Before I went into Congress, one of the things I was doing was writing regular monthly reports for them about the Supreme Court. You can find stuff there. You can check out my book, Overruling Democracy. I've got another older book called The Wealth Primary about money and politics. But the stuff at People for American Way will give you a lot of my views about Citizens United and how we're going to combat the tyranny of money in our politics. Again, let me thank you all for your amazing hard work, your attention, your great study, your great reading, your great engagement with our speakers. And I feel only sad that we haven't gotten to know each other in physical person, but we've got the rest of our lives to do that. So stay in close touch. And if there's anything that we can do to help you, you know, we are always here for you. And let's keep working together through November to win this election. And thanks for your participation in Democracy Summer. You made us all very proud.
Thanks so much.